Although best known for his decisive victory at the Battle of Hastings, William, Duke of Normandy, fought several battles prior to this in his struggle to hold on to his own duchy and expand beyond its frontiers. The battle and the entire Norman conquest had its beginnings long before, on an autumn day way back in 1027. It was then that a young woman named Herleva, daughter of Fulbert and the mistress of Robert, the 6th Duke of Normandy, gave birth to a baby boy. This teenaged romance had begun, according to legend, when the 17-year-old Robert had been smitten with the young and innocent Herleva, a year younger, dancing in the street. Another story has Robert overcome with lust as he beheld Herleva's shapely body bending down as she washed clothes in a stream. As in such stories, Herleva conceived after just one night of passion, even having a prophetic dream in which branches sprouted from her body to encompass the entirety of both Normandy and England. Whatever the true beginnings of the romance, what is known is that Herleva was not the daughter of a tanner, despite fanciful claims to the contrary. Herleva's father, Fulbert, the future conqueror's maternal grandfather, was actually a burgess, the household official at the Norman court, who, though not quite as prestigious as the military elite, was hardly low-born either. Robert, the baby William's father, had not been born to be duke, but had become so after around a year of civil war. His elder brother Richard had become the 5th Duke, aged just 18. Robert, though, as precocious and wily as his future son William would become, had declared his independence and concentrated his power in the castle of Val-ès, where Herleva conceived and gave birth to William. Duke Richard marched on this stronghold of resistance and compelled his brother Robert to sue for peace. However, no sooner had his brother forced his submission did Richard drop dead just a year into his reign. Robert then assumed the mantle of Duke, though it was commonly whispered he had gained his power with the assistance of some well-placed poison, a traditional method of assassination in Norman history. Duke Robert would rule his duchy for 9 years, though not with Herleva at his side. For whatever reason, he married her off to a certain Helune, and she would go on to produce 2 half-brothers for William, Robert, and, most notoriously, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. The mother of the conqueror died in 1050, long before the spectacular rise of her first son to royalty. Robert himself would never marry or sire any future sons, who could compete with his bastard William. William, as it would turn out, was certainly Duke Robert's son in his proclivity to wage war. Robert's reign was marked with war and domestic chaos. His conflicts with the church, most notably against his uncle Robert, the Archbishop of Rouen, caused the duchy to be excommunicated for a time, till the exiled archbishop was permitted to return. Robert also waged war against his neighbours, coming entangled in the Flemish Civil War, and then the internal struggles of the French royal family itself, even harbouring King Henry I for a time, against his mother Constance, who favoured the king's younger brother, yet another Robert, as king over him. This assistance was rewarded when Henry gave Duke Robert the Vexin region. The other significant conflict of the time was Robert's attack on Alan III, Duke of Brittany. Alan had designs on Mont Saint-Michel and was expanding his influence out of Reims. Robert in response had sacked Dole and repelled Alan's forces from the region, though eventually peace was brokered by Archbishop Robert, thus securing Robert's western frontier for a time. It was at this point that Duke Robert made a surprisingly and perhaps bizarre decision to modernise. He decided to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the surface, this seems crazy given the incessant warfare and political intrigue that infested the time. Yet religious devotion was not always a skin-deep one. Other major figures of the period would also make the journey, for example Fulk Nerra, Count of Anjou, and Geoffrey of Brittany. This marked change in attitude towards the church and Normandy's powerful clergy, is also evidenced in his return of all lands he and his vassals had confiscated from the Abbey of Fécamp by 1034. Another possibility is that Robert was simply worn out by the constant war and political intrigue that his position necessarily entailed, and thus decided to take some time. Whatever the reasons and motives, Robert could not be swayed by the pleas of his advisors, including Archbishop Robert. Before departing, however, William's father did compel the magnates gathered at his court to swear fealty to the 8-year-old boy as his heir. Early in 1035, Robert left his duchy, accompanied with an armed escort, into the east. It is certain that the Duke made it to Jerusalem, and perhaps even stopped off in Constantinople on his way back, but he certainly did not make it past Bithynia, where he died on the 3rd of July. This left his young son William a lamb amongst the wolves. William had until that point been left with his mother, Herleva, in Falaise, but in a short space of time, the bastard heir of the recently deceased Duke had been catapulted into the mainstream of French powers. William was in fact the inheritor of the levers of a relatively young state structure. Normandy itself, literally the land of the Northmen, had been founded by William's ancestor, Rollo, by treaty in just 911. Back then, the original Viking chieftain, granted the Rouen region, had been a count. The land had been gifted Rollo and his followers in return for their protection against other raiders. The colonists, though, quickly traded their longships for fierce war horses, with Rollo and his immediate heirs expanding Norman influence over the years. Norman power settled during the 50-year reign of Duke Richard the Fearless. It was during Richard's long reign that the blending of Viking and French cultures converged, with the old language and religion finally giving way to Christianity and a hybrid tongue. In Richard's reign, the Normans fully committed to their Christian faith, though kinship with their Norse and Danish cousins was never wholly discarded, as Viking use of Normandy as a winter base during their frequent raids in England would show, as late as 1014. Norman power also grew during this era, the Pact of Guisers elevating Richard from the Count of Rouen to that of all of Normandy, in return for Richard's acknowledgement of Hugh Capet as his overlord. Later, Richard II would extend Normandy's power further. Richard, known as the Good, was the first of his line to take the title Duke, allowing his lessers the distinction of claiming the titles Count and Viscount under that. Under Richard II, Normandy also began to look further afield from northern France and its Scandinavian links, even entertaining some designs for a Norman role in England. King Ethelred II of England had recently invaded the Cotentin Peninsula, perhaps in an attempt to kidnap the Duke, but had been driven back. The duchy had been a known base of Viking raids on England, and so with this military failure concentrating minds, the king turned to diplomacy to pacify this southern threat. The marriage of Emma, daughter of Richard the Fearless and sister of Duke Richard II, the future Duke William II's grandfather, was a significant event in this whole saga. It was certainly a major coup for the Normans, marrying into one of the major royal families of Europe. By 1002 then, Normandy had important links with both the French and English courts. Emma's marriage would eventually prove disastrous for the native English, with her two marriages, first to Ethelred and then to his vanquisher Canute the Great, ultimately facilitating the conquest of England by two foreign powers, the latter of which would be permanent. Back in the 1030s, Queen Emma's great-nephew William faced the inevitable instability that his father's early death entailed. With many local tyrants rising to consolidate their power, Normandy essentially descended into civil war and blood feuding, a process only worsened by the death of the boy duke's great-uncle, Robert, Archbishop of Rouen, in 1037. Fortunately for William, the focus of threats to the government of the duchy itself were not directly centred on him, but more on his regents and the inner circle. Turold, a guardian of William, was murdered in the very bedchamber of Duke William himself, as was, quite infamously, Osborne the steward, who had his throat cut while William slept nearby, though other versions maintain that William was even awake to witness the deed. With such events burned into the young boy's brain, it was no wonder that William became the hardened and ruthless man who so brutally seized England much later in 1066. Back in the 1040s, he was far from safe in his own person or even to his own title of Duke, let alone in any position to claim England. The years 1040 to 41 saw William's relative honeymoon period evaporate with the first serious challenge against the young Duke himself. A certain Roger of Tosny, a hero of the wars in Spain against the Moors, raised the standard of revolt against William, citing his bastardy, but he was defeated by Roger de Beaumont. William's rule in Normandy was shaky to say the least, but was ultimately secured by the intervention of King Henry I of France. An unruly Normandy to his north was not to be taken lightly. Trade would be severely impeded by a civil war in Normandy, with many trade routes cut off. What's more, Henry was William's overlord, and the various attempts to either make William a puppet to special interests, or even to dislodge him altogether, was also an indirect affront to King Henry himself, who had affirmed Robert's choice of William as his heir, and had received affirmations of William's own vassalage to him. A third, perhaps weaker reason, given the realpolitik of the time, was Henry's own sense of obligation to William's family, as Robert had harboured him during his own time of trouble. In 1046, a major revolt finally flared up, centred around Guy of Burgundy and Lower Normandy. Guy was the legitimate son of the Count of Burgundy, and more importantly Alice, the daughter of Richard the Good. Guy was thus a legitimate grandson of Duke Richard II, and pressed his own claim to the duchy. Guy's own power was centred on the fortresses of Vernon and Brionne. However, his support was based largely in the west, backed by the powerful Viscount of Cotentin and Bessin, as well as a coalition of others. This rebellion kicked off with a brazen attempt to assassinate the 19-year-old William himself. Narrowly escaping his would-be assassins, legend has it that William then rode in an epic 16-hour journey through the night to his birthplace Val-ès, before making his way to King Henry himself and formally requesting his aid as his liegeman. Henry obliged, and with a majority French force, he and William crossed the frontier back into Normandy in early 1047, moving towards Caen. Passing Argentan, the French army finally contacted Guy's rebel force on the plains of Val-es-Dunes, just after they had crossed the River Orne. The teenage Duke William was about to be bloodied in his first true battle. The rebel leaders trusted Ralph Tesson, given his local knowledge and control of the only crossing of the Orne south of Caen. The battle was essentially a series of cavalry clashes in which William is remembered as fighting ferociously, maybe even killing Harder of Bayeux, the champion of Ranulph of Avranches. The turning point of this battle came with the betrayal of Ralph Tesson, who had switched sides by attacking the rebel rear. The rebels did not break straight off, fighting desperately, with a certain Hamo even managing to unhorse King Henry himself before being slain. Nigel of Cotentin, another leader, also fought well, though it was all for nothing given the rebels were caught between two pincers. Not long into this, many tried to break off, but were either put to the sword or driven into the Orne, where many drowned. Val-es-Dunes was a pivotal event in the life of William the Conqueror, but it was not William that day who had conquered, but Henry, his liege. Henry's victory was aided by the betrayal of Ralph Tesson, which the young Duke rewarded by marrying him to a niece of Herleva. As for Guy of Burgundy, he escaped the battle badly wounded, tried to carry on the struggle with guerrilla raids, but was eventually forced into ignominious surrender. With Guy safely sent back off into exile in Burgundy, William repaid his overlord's vital support by accompanying him the following year to a siege in Anjou. By October of 1047, William presided over a council at Caen, attended by many lords and prelates, having all present swear on holy relics to adhere to the truce of God, an agreement rejected years before, which restricted warfare in the duchy to certain times. All private war was thus prohibited from Wednesday until Monday morning, and at all times during Advent, Lent, Easter and Pentecost, with anybody violating this prohibition being excommunicated. Of course, this did not apply to William himself or the King of France, which effectively gave the young Duke a monopoly of violence within his own duchy. Apart from this truce, William also tied potentially hostile lords to him through kinship, notably the aforementioned Ralph. Even at this stage too, William crafted around himself a close-knit inner circle of brothers in arms, his half-brothers Odo and Robert, as well as William Fitzosborne and Roger Montgomery. In 1049, William managed to notably have his half-brother Odo replace Hugh as Bishop of Bayeux. Another indication that William was rapidly showing himself to be a great power player in the region was his decision to ask for the hand in marriage of Matilda, daughter of Count Baldwin V of Flanders. This marriage would in theory secure the goodwill of his eastern neighbour and also strengthen relations with the French king, given Matilda was his niece. Such an alliance would also signal, in no uncertain terms, to any more potential rebels that William was here to stay. Unfortunately, one obstacle prevented the match: the Church. On another level, there may have been objections from the potential bride herself. It is said that she rejected William's suit on her own account, given her own distinguished pedigree as a descendant of the King of France and even King Alfred the Great. She saw herself as above such a match with the bastard son of a duke. William was said to have been so incensed by this rebuff that he rode all the way to Flanders himself. Arriving, he found Matilda on horseback en route to church. Then he dragged her off a mount by the braids before riding back to Normandy. Another version has the encounter taking place in her chambers, with William similarly dragging her to the ground by her braids. According to this legend, Baldwin, Matilda's father, was angered with William's treatment of his daughter, and even desired to cross swords with him. But Matilda had actually been pleased, not only consenting to be William's wife, but demanding it, and rebuking any other suitor. Yet whatever Matilda's personal thoughts and feelings on the marriage, the real obstacle was the Pope, who forbade the match on the grounds of consanguinity. In truth, church objections may really have been due to the political situation, with a potential marriage alliance between Flanders and Normandy being unpalatable to many other powers in the region. Despite these objections, the two were married in around 1052, though other indications, such as Matilda's name on charter documents, suggest the union may have been sealed as early as 1050. Ever the skilled politician, William may very well have sent a delegation to Rome itself, persuading the Pope that if such a match were not allowed, then the Church would be indirectly sanctioning a war on Normandy, as Flanders would attack them, given the perceived insult to them. More likely, the marriage simply went ahead, securing an important alliance that would eventually enable William to settle matters in England. In return for the Pope's blessing, husband and wife agreed to build 2 monasteries, which they duly did in Caen. In the 1050s, with his own domain secure and his policy of centralisation through intermarriage bearing fruit, William pursued a clever policy of expansion, the better to focus his powerful nobles' collective attentions outward rather than in, and binding their interests to his own. In 1051, while crisis was brewing in England between Godwin, his family, and King Edward the Confessor, William struck into the Boleyn border region, tangling himself in a complex web of competing obligations to both him and his rival Geoffrey Martel, Count of Anjou. The feudal obligations in this region were a mess, The Val-ès owed fealty to William, according to him, for Alencon, but also to King Henry for Val-ès itself, and to the Count of Anjou for the castle of Domfront. William, for his part, most likely simply saw the mess as a prime opportunity to expand his own power to a contested region, and with the French king's leave, advanced into Maine. Geoffrey, however, declined battle and retreated, leaving Domfront to be besieged by William. The castle had been heavily fortified by both the Val-ès and Geoffrey, and the latter was evidently confident that the young duke had no real chance of taking it. William evidently saw things very differently, as not only did he settle down for a siege here, but also ordered a rapid and wholly unexpected dash towards Alencon, almost taking the place by simply galloping full tilt through its gates. The townsfolk managed to close the gates in time and made the mistake, taunting their would-be invader. Confident that William could not besiege both Domfront and Alencon simultaneously, the citizens of Alencon mocked the duke's bastardy, and it was said they stood on the walls yelling, "Hides, hides for the tanner!" Big mistake. William was always lucky and ingenious in equal measure, and, finding a way to have Alencon betrayed to him, brooded darkly on the insult to his mother and his own heritage. In a vengeful mood, William had 32 leading men of the town rounded up. He then paraded them out of town to the nearby bridge, and in full view of the rest of the townsfolk, had their hands and feet cut off. This horrific spectacle more than convinced the last bulwark of defence centred in the town's citadel to surrender. Furthermore, it demonstrated to the men of Domfront just what kind of man they were up against, and they too quickly submitted, though with the expressed promise that they too would not suffer the same grisly fate as those men at Alencon. At age just 25, William's campaign into the southern frontier had been a startling success. It certainly tarnished the reputation of Geoffrey Martel, while gaining William the thanks and enhanced loyalty of a key lieutenant, Roger of Montgomery, who married Mabel of Bellême, eventual heiress of the territory. A key area had thus been secured. Yet one negative consequence of the conflict was the growing concern of King Henry, William's old protector. In an abrupt turnaround, the king sided with Geoffrey against William. Their excuse came in 1053, when the final serious revolt against William emerged in the form of another William, the brother of the Archbishop of Rouen, and the most powerful man in Upper Normandy. This anti-William arguably had a better claim to the duchy for his legitimate descent, and, if he coordinated his efforts with the French king and Geoffrey Martel, would surely have emerged victorious, with the history of both Normandy, England and the world being unrecognisable today. Indeed, things were bad for William, first, with some troops sent by him to garrison a citadel switching sides. Henry spent a considerable amount of time, perhaps too much time, building up his strength, so that he only moved against William by 1054. William used the time to combat the rebellious nobles throughout 1053, and split his forces into two to meet King Henry's double invasion. Henry himself led the main force through Evreux, while his brother Odo invaded in the east. The right wing was caught raping and pillaging by William's army around daybreak in the town of Mortemer. Blocking off all the exits and lanes, the Normans then proceeded to set fire to the town, driving the French out into the waiting swords and lances of their enemies. This melee lasted from daybreak to around 3 PM, and when the cries of the vanquished finally began to die down, the victorious Normans held Odo, the king's very brother, as well as Guy, Count of Ponthieu, as their prisoners. William sent an envoy to proclaim his victory to the French king at his camp, which prompted Henry to retreat ingloriously out of Norman territory. Henry was then forced to concede a humiliating peace with his overmighty vassal, promising to side with William in any dispute with Geoffrey in exchange for the release of many French lords now rotting in Norman dungeons. King Henry had been forced to accept a humiliating peace to ensure the return of French nobles languishing in Norman prisons, and was further required to pledge non-interference in any conflict between William and Geoffrey. This was initially easy for Henry, given the Count of Anjou had failed to materialise on the field of battle against William. William pressed home his advantage by seizing the fortress of Ambrières, thinking to provoke Geoffrey into attacking. Geoffrey did not bite, though, and merely waited for William to depart the area before laying siege to Ambrières, along with William of Aquitaine, and then promptly running away when the bastard turned back to confront them. The years of 1055 to 57 were ones of rare quiet and peace, both within and without William's domain, but it would turn out to be the proverbial calm before the storm. King Henry had not forgotten his humbling at Mortemer, and desired to crush the upstart Duke once and for all. To this end, he plotted yet another invasion of Normandy, with William's other great rival, Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou, the two men meeting in early 1057. They once again settled on the plan of a two-pronged invasion, this time focusing their wrath on the western Caen-Bayeux region of the duchy. William was ready, his spies keeping him well informed. He exiled some unreliable men from his domain to mitigate any internal help being rendered to the invaders, before preparing for the inevitable clash that may very well have decided his fate, and possibly even whether he lived or died. In August of 1057, King Henry's army crossed the frontier into Normandy, aiming to split it in two by harrying the land up to Dives. William initially allowed this, allowing Henry's army to penetrate deep into his territory, with the probable aim being to strike Henry on his return journey home. The brutal devastation of the land, however, forced William to act sooner than he may have done. The king's army reached the Dives River, putting the Besson area to the sword and fire, and even sacking Caen itself. Henry then moved across the Dives to continue his bloody work. Meanwhile, William had mustered his force at Falaise and waited for the opportune moment to strike. On receiving news of Henry's likely crossing, the Duke raced to the area to strike the king unawares. Henry had planned to get his entire force across the river at low tide. However, the bridge collapsed halfway through this process, leaving the king's vanguard dangerously exposed on the far side of the rising river, and Henry's rear, baggage and booty particularly vulnerable on the other side. William the Bastard's legendary luck shone fully that day in August, as he arrived to find his enemy divided and exposed. The Normans thundered into the Frankish rear, provoking a general pandemonium, which quickly devolved into a massacre. Those Franks, not run through with Norman lances and swords, met their deaths by drowning in the swollen Dives River. King Henry, meanwhile, could do nothing but watch on impotently, the cries of his men prompting his shaken advisors to suggest a withdrawal from the duchy. Henry wholeheartedly agreed, even vowing never to cross the frontier into Normandy ever again. When the day's bloody work was done, William only accepted a peace if Henry gave up the disputed border fortress of Tillières. This was conceded, and a ceasefire of sorts was agreed, but not a formal peace, given William, ambitious and ruthless as ever, further seized the fortress of Driment near Dreux, which was squarely in French territory. This was a step too far, even for the defeated and humbled Henry, which meant peace was not formalised until after his death in 1060. With William's victory at Varaville ensuring the integrity of his borders, 1060 also proved a golden year in the fortunes of the future conqueror. King Henry expired on 4th of August, some 3 years after his humiliation at Varaville, leaving his 8-year-old son Philip to take up his crown. On November 14th, 1060, Geoffrey Martel also died, destabilising the county of Anjou and depriving William of yet another dangerous rival. William thus enjoyed an effective hegemony over the French-speaking world that allowed him to start plotting even more ambitious plans.